What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some Divinity lore, specifically about the Orcs, as the title would have almost certainly told you, because I've been craving a little bit of discussion about the franchise, of course. Now, basically, since we got the announcement last December about the upcoming Divinity title, simply labeled Divinity, I've already made a bunch of different videos talking about the lore and ways they could take the series, because if you just somehow don't know this by now, I used to be a straight-up Divinity lore channel. It used to be the only thing I did. More recently, with Larian becoming popular, there are, I would say, more people trying to do that, but for a significant period of time, I was pretty much the only person making those videos. It's kind of how I got my foot in the door there. And I was making those videos because I really just love the universe and this upcoming game, making strides to solidify admittedly very fractured lore and direct contradictions within the games that they've already stated in like interviews and stuff. They've hired people literally just to do that, is especially noteworthy to me, obviously. But one thing really stuck out to me even with that initial announcement, which I actually even mentioned at the time, and that was the depiction of the character that I likely used as the thumbnail for this video. This sort of mid-celebration orcish looking character. This was noteworthy for a few reasons. One, this is not typically how orcs have looked across the series. Orcs are also not typically welcomed in human civilizations. It is not unheard of, which we'll get into obviously, but it is unusual. So just that in and of itself is worth noting. And then, of course, there's the fact that Larian kind of wanted to expand what the orcs were in the previous games multiple times and just didn't have the ability to do so, usually down to things like time and money, which they these days have in spades. So what I would like to do with this video is basically go over all of that stuff, how we see the orcs presented throughout the series, and then, of course, see whatever happens with the upcoming title and how they are depicted there. And I think that's actually more interesting than it might initially sound if you love the lore here, because something people may not know is the more interesting races like the elves and things in this series and their cannibalistic tendencies, almost all of the lore for them comes from a singular game, that being Divinity Original Sin 2. So them using a single game to expand greatly on an individual race like that would not be strange at all. All of that to say, if this does well, I might do some more of these around some of the other races, but, you know, we'll see what happens. Chances are I'll probably do them anyway at some point, but timing tends to matter. So let's start with the stuff I've already mentioned. I mentioned that orcs do not typically look the way this orc does. What's that about? Well, in all of the previous games, orcs were a mix of generally more humanoid with noticeably enlarged heads in their earliest depictions in the original game Divine Divinity, and then in later entries like Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2, they were shown with really elongated heads, and also more of a pig-like face, which was traditional orc stuff back in the day. Although even then it did kind of feel like they got some of like the posturing and how those orcs were animated was almost more gorilla-like in nature. So there's that as well, which I mention specifically because the way this potentially orc looks like in this trailer is very different, which means they're either simply adding the possibility that these guys look more humanoid, which is the most likely option, or what they're doing is rewriting a bunch of lore in order to make half-orcs a thing, because your mind may well jump to, well, you know, what if it's a half-orc? Which is an innocent enough question that, while definitely possible, they could certainly do that, to be clear, especially given the other stuff I've talked about in my lore primers and stuff about the setup coming into this new Divinity game. But as it stands, what we know right now is that half-races are not really a thing in this particular universe, because these races were all made by their respective deities. Vrogir, in the case of the orcs. We don't really see half anything anywhere, and that is by design because of the way the races and the setup is made. Now, as I mentioned though, it's kind of changing with Divinity. At the start of this upcoming Divinity game, if they follow everything they've done already, which they've already said they will be doing, theoretically all of those gods, for the most part, should be dead outside of a couple who aren't associated with races anyway. The idea that because of their deities being lost and how all of that worked, the idea that now, for whatever reason, say some sort of magical force barring it from happening, might result in half races, could certainly be something they could work on, but that would just be speculation. So already you can see that just this brief showing of this singular character in this trailer just gave me a lot of questions, which is why I clocked it basically immediately when I saw it the first time. But from there, let's talk about what we see throughout the rest of the games. Now, as I already mentioned, all of the orcs were made by the deity Vrogir. Vrogir was one of the Eternals who, some undisclosed but extraordinarily long time ago, alongside his, let's say, compatriot Eternals, the other would-be deities, discovered the Veil of Source, used its power to turn themselves into gods, and banished the rest of their people. The Eternals that were left, of which there were 8 of them, then made races in their likeness. Vrogir made the Orcs, a warrior people that have often at times been taken advantage of by the others, because while they are physically strong and capable of larger, I would say, planning and forethought, that is not typically how they have been presented throughout the series. If anything, another interesting through line is that orcs are regularly taken advantage of by simply misdirecting and deceiving them by the long-running bad guys of the series, the Black Ring, and even the Immaculates in Original Sin 1. Literally several times throughout the games, we see orcs deliberately misled or misinformed and taken advantage of in order to turn their military might against a given foe. And again, given the context of the upcoming Divinity game and how we see things kind of go sideways there, it's not beyond fathomable that this would happen again, since the Black Ring and Damien should still be around, Damien being like the big bad guy of the series. Now, this often happens because the orcs themselves are tribalistic. They are just all sorts of different tribes brought together, occasionally for various reasons. Now, the thing is, while there are some obvious through lines, these individual tribes are also greatly autonomous. Most of them call the deserts of Youthful Gore home. However, the series as a whole does not have like a consistent geography, so exactly where that desert is hard to like point to on a given map, but they're said to be mostly in the deserts of Youthful Gore, usually only really seen elsewhere in order to raid and pillage everybody else. But while that is what they are known for most, they are still a sentient humanoid race capable of speech and thought. However, they have greatly varying levels of intelligence. Many of them are, I would say, relatively simple-minded warriors, but you do occasionally find some of them that are definitely more intellectual than others. We see that in the very first game with Croxy, an orc that aids your journey in that game several times, in fact, but he himself is a bit of an outcast from his fellow orcs because of his ability to, I would say, be more reasonable. Most of them, as a result, are very militaristic and warmongering in nature. However, an individual tribe choosing to instead trade with and or ally with nearby settlements of other races and everything is not unheard of by any means. It's just unusual and definitely not the norm. Now, the old website for the original game, which, again, how canon that is hard to say, also does actually mention warlords dreaming of uniting all of the orcs under a single banner, the way we see more often with the other races, which are a bit more united. Also, probably worth a mention that throughout the series, especially the later games, it does seem like they intended to make the orcs a more matriarchal society. You often see female leaders there. There was Gruntilda shown to be the leader of her band of orcs in Original Sin 1. There was also some speculation that there was initially supposed to be a female leader of the orcs shown off in Dragon Commander, but that wound up being cut and they are not in that game. So again, how canon that is up for debate, and whether or not they choose to carry that forward wouldn't be a surprise either way, but there is some evidence to suggest that they may be matriarchal. Now from there, I kind of want to run through what the orcs look like throughout the series in terms of how they are presented game by game. Now I'm going to go in the order the games were released rather than chronological order, because a sort of fun fact about Divinity lore you'll have likely heard me mention if you've watched any of my videos about it up to this point is that a lot of it is a bit messy and contradictory, and while you can sort of dig for a bottom baseline to follow until we see the more unified, established approach that they started taking in later games, and then with the upcoming game having a team of people dedicated to doing just that, all of this could definitely at least change a little bit. So, starting with Divine Divinity, orcs primarily play an antagonistic role here, being either tricked or enslaved by the Black Ring in the area in order to attack the human settlements as part of furthering the plans of the god Chaos, which is part of the broader plot of that game as a whole, which I've got other videos covering if you want the full breakdown of. But the gist of it is that the orcs were simply a blunt tool here being used by the actual people in charge. However, this game also introduces reinforces the fact that these are still individuals capable of thought, and while a lot of them might not be the brightest bulbs, they are certainly capable of intellectualism, as we see. There are certainly more capable orcs among them, such as Croxy, which becomes one of the Council of 7 members. That's actually an important thing to mention here as well, because something you'll also learn from this game is that the Orcs always had a bit of an antagonistic role with the rest of the races. There was some speculation that at one point they weren't even considered to be sapient, and while they are not well loved, they were eventually considered to be sapient and were given a spot on the council. The council is basically a representative of each of the races of the deities who would fight back against chaos. We actually see this happen before Divine Divinity even, with whoever came before Croxy. I believe at least one of them was named Godar, but he doesn't actually appear anywhere outside of brief mentions. And ultimately, Croxy winds up being the only council member that lives outside of Zandalore who's a series regular. So Croxy, thanks to where this game takes place on the timeline, could theoretically still be around for the new game that is coming out if they wanted to do that. But those are really the main things we get about the Orcs just in the very first game. They're given a very antagonistic role. Their position as sapient is honestly up for debate sometimes. They're shown to primarily be a very warmongering race, with only a handful of them being truly capable of rational discussion with most others, and they are being used as a tool by the Black Ring, a threat that is still a threat in the most current timeline for the new game. Now, the next game released after this was Beyond Divinity. There isn't really any orc representation in Beyond Divinity, so there's nothing to really say here. That game takes place on a different plane called Nemesis and follows the tale of Damien's escape from the place following the events of the first game, as it takes place roughly 20-ish years later. But then we have Divinity 2, Ego Draconis. Now, interestingly enough, timeline-wise, Divinity 2 Ego Draconis takes place the farthest out. Original Sin 2, the most recent game to be released, was actually about 60 years in the timeline before Divinity 2. I realistically think if they're going to cut most of anything, it will likely be Divinity 2. However, Orcs also don't get a ton of representation in this game. That said, they do get a couple of brief mentions and conversations here, basically being mentioned to still be slaves to the Black Ring. And we also, in those same conversations, get confirmation that the Orcs are still hanging around Youthful Gore. Following on from Divinity 2, we then have Dragon Commander. Now, as I already kind of mentioned towards the beginning, the Orcs themselves don't actually feature in Dragon Commander. There was some speculation on some content that ultimately did not make it into the game about them supposed to have had some representation there that didn't make it, and that it would have shown off another female orc leader, but again, mostly irrelevant since it never really happened. But where things get really interesting is actually Divinity Original Sin 1, because despite taking place roughly 1200 or so years before the original game, Divine Divinity, in the timeline, Original Sin 1 shows off the orcs quite a bit. However, they look a lot different here as well, and it's where a lot of the clearest visuals for them comes from. Now, even here, we mostly see the orcs being manipulated by a group called the Immaculates, which are basically the bad guys for this game. Outside of towards the end, we actually see one group of orcs led by their matriarch that are simply taking advantage of the situation for their own gain. So while they are still primarily shown as an antagonistic race, a lot of which are a bit on the dull side, we actually do see several depictions of them that are, again, more in line with some of them at least being reasonable people you could have a discussion with. We see this as early as the first town in the game, actually. The mayor of the town of Syseal has actually adopted a younger orc woman as his daughter. She basically stays holed up in the library there because she is an orc and people don't necessarily like them very much. In fact, there's a side quest to kill her if you want. But this orc woman's name is Victoria, and by all accounts, she is a perfectly upstanding member of society. She's actually really helpful and informative if you talk to her, and obviously serves to show you that orcs can be more than just mindless monsters. Now, also in that first town area, you can meet another orc that is grieving for the death of his brother in the recent attacks on the town of Syseal, and he's more or less just a regular orc that you can actually stop and talk to for a minute because he's so overcome with grief that he's a little more malleable to a conversation. But really the biggest depiction of orcs in Original Sin 1 is actually towards the end of the game, where they are occupying a town with another force as well, but they are a bit antagonistic with them. Now this is because Gruntilda, the leader of the Orcs in this area, is after the Bloodstones. Bloodstones are a key item in Original Sin 1 that are a way to gather power. Gruntilda wants those in order to give herself more power, which is a problem for you, the character, because you need those things. Gruntilda is shown many times over, however, to be a truly evil being, as she is taking advantage of her son, who is shown to have the mind of a child even by Orc standards, and is the subject of one of the companion quests in that game. But she's also interesting beyond those things simply because Gruntilda shows us an orc that is not only actively not being taken advantage of in some way, but is in fact taking advantage of others, which is the other part of it. So, as you would imagine, the orcs are not fond of being misled and misdirected all the time. In many cases, they take it as a personal insult, and it is not unheard of for them to turn on the very people that they are working with once they discover that this is happening, which makes them always a bit volatile, as you would guess. But in the case of Gruntilda, it is shown that with a competent enough leader, they can in fact be the ones doing some of the underhanded things. And I think it also does a pretty good job of showing you that while these orcs do have a general sense of like honor and things that you can see mentioned here throughout the series, they are not only easily manipulated by others and enslaved even, they are even subject to this exact same thing by their own leaders. Putting all of that together, however, I would mostly say that orcs are interesting in the Divinity series purely because they have never quite gotten the spotlight that I think Larian wanted to give them. You can definitely see in many places there's more they wanted to do there, because, as you may well have noticed, I skipped Divinity Original Sin 2, and that is because the only orcs we meet in that game are dead, and we don't really hear anything about them outside of a conversation with Vrogir, their god, as part of the main story of that game. Also, an interesting note about Vrogir, his portrait that you can find in that game shows him to be an almost more demonic entity as well, which I always thought was neat, is still pretty much all we see from them in that game. So even the most recent game to be released doesn't have a ton to say about them, and this is almost certainly because of time and budget constraints that they were dealing with back then, as great as Original Sin 2 is. So I think if you take all of this information and start putting it all together and seeing what it is they wanted to do with it, now that they have the time and the resources to really flesh out this world in a satisfying way, I am excited to see what they wind up doing with orcs, if this character they're even showing in this trailer is an orc. And I suppose when we get to learning more about the upcoming Divinity game, we will in fact learn just that. But as for today in this video, that's pretty much all I've got for you. Certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, stick around, all that YouTube jazz. I won't be purely doing Divinity stuff between now and the upcoming title's release, but it is by far and away my most anticipated game, and I will be making videos like this along the way. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.